In the corridors of power, few things can be as alluring and as dangerous as the promise of wealth. Throughout history, many have succumbed to temptation, taking bribes and compromising their integrity for the promise of riches. But for one man in the kingdom of ancient Persia, a simple act of greed would lead to a horrifying and unforgettable punishment. This is the story of Babrak, a high-ranking official in the royal court, and how his decision to take a bribe from a rival led to an unimaginable fate, one that would send shockwaves throughout the kingdom. Babrak was a trusted official in the court of King Shahriar, a ruler known for his wealth, power, and a keen eye for loyalty. He held a prominent position in the royal administration and was respected by his peers, yet his ambition knew no bounds. His role gave him access to vast amounts of royal wealth, influence, and power, but it also exposed him to the undercurrents of corruption that flowed through the kingdom. Like many others, Babrak was enticed by the corrupting power of wealth. His rise to power had been fueled by ambition, and over time he had become more and more disillusioned with the limits of his role. He believed that the only way to truly secure his place in the kingdom was to increase his wealth and fast. It was then that a rival nobleman, who had long been at odds with the king, approached Babrak with an offer he could not refuse, a bribe. This bribe was meant to be a game-changer for Babrak. In exchange for the king's private plans regarding a major military campaign, the rival nobleman promised to fill Babrak's coffers with more wealth than he had ever imagined. Greed clouded Babrak's judgment, and he made the fateful decision to accept the bribe. He passed on the king's confidential information to the rival nobleman, completely unaware of the far-reaching consequences his actions would bring. However, what Babrak did not anticipate was the king's ability to see through deceit and betrayal. King Shahriar, despite his wealth and power, was not a fool. He had a reputation for his sharp mind and his keen understanding of the political games played in his court. Shahriar had long suspected that corruption was at play within his kingdom, but he had always been cautious about who he trusted. The king's spies were everywhere, and it was only a matter of time before Babrak's treachery came to light. One night, Babrak was summoned to the royal palace under the guise of an important meeting with the king. When he arrived, he was greeted not by the warm hospitality of the court, but by the cold, menacing presence of Shahriar, who had already been informed of Babrak's actions. The king's eyes burned with fury, not just from the betrayal, but from the breach of trust. What followed was a punishment so cruel and severe that it would become a part of Persian legend. Shahriar did not choose to kill Babrak outright, as many would have expected. Instead, he chose a punishment that would forever mark the corrupt official for his crime, a punishment that would leave an indelible scar on both his body and soul. The king, in a horrifying act of vengeance, decreed that Babrak's skin would be peeled off, a punishment that would not only humiliate him but would also serve as a stark warning to anyone else who dared betray the king's trust. Babrak's screams filled the palace as he was bound and subjected to the horrific act. The king's guards, cold and detached, carried out the gruesome order with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that Babrak would not survive the ordeal. As his skin was torn away, the once proud man was reduced to a helpless, broken figure, his body mangled and exposed. The pain was unbearable, and in his final moments, Babrak begged for mercy, crying out for the king to end his suffering. But Shahriar, resolute and unforgiving, allowed him no reprieve. When the brutal act was finally complete, Babrak's life had been stripped away just as his skin had been. He was left to die alone and in agony, a grotesque symbol of the consequences of greed and betrayal. The death of Babrak reverberated throughout the entire kingdom. His brutal punishment was not just a personal tragedy, but a message sent to every noble, every official, and every citizen who lived under the reign of Shahriar. The king had acted swiftly and decisively, but it was the manner in which he had chosen to carry out the punishment that shook the kingdom to its core. It was a message that resonated with a chilling finality. Betrayal would not be tolerated, and corruption would be met with ruthless retribution. For days after Babrak's execution, the courtiers and nobles of the royal court whispered about the events that had unfolded in the palace. No one was willing to speak openly about it, but the fear was palpable. The once untouchable nobles, who had grown accustomed to playing their political games, knew that they were now being watched more closely than ever before. The king's vengeance had not just been about one man's crime, it had become a lesson for all who sought to deceive or betray the ruler of the land. The fear of retribution weighed heavily on the kingdom. Many who had once plotted and schemed in the shadows now saw the power of Shahriar in a new light. The king had shown his willingness to go to extreme lengths to protect his rule and maintain the integrity of his kingdom. His actions sent a clear warning to anyone who thought they could corrupt the system or undermine the crown. In the weeks that followed the king's spies reported that many of the noblemen who had been involved in underhanded dealings or illicit activities began to tread carefully, watching their every step and avoiding anything that might bring suspicion upon them. But while the king's vengeance struck fear into the hearts of the guilty, it also sparked a conversation among the people of the kingdom. The common folk, who had long suffered under the oppressive rule of corrupt officials, began to feel a sense of justice. Babrak had been a man who, despite his immense wealth and power, had fallen victim to his own greed and ambition. His fate served as a stark reminder that even the highest in the land could be brought low by their own choices. For the people, Babrak's downfall was a symbol of the justice they had long been denied. As news of Babrak's brutal punishment spread to the far corners of the kingdom, the people's fear turned to admiration for the king. Shahriar, who had long been viewed as a ruler of great wealth but uncertain morality, was now seen as a monarch willing to act decisively for the good of the kingdom. The image of the king who took Babrak's skin became a symbol of a ruler who is unafraid to take extreme measures to protect his kingdom from corruption. Yet, as the weeks passed, the king's harsh action also began to raise questions about the true nature of justice. Though Babrak had indeed committed a grievous crime, many began to wonder whether the king's punishment had been too cruel. Was it right for a ruler to mete out such a gruesome and public execution for one man's betrayal? Some whispered that Shahriar's vengeance had been driven not just by justice, but by personal anger, and that he had gone too far in making an example of the man. Despite these whispers, Shahriar's rule continued to be strong. His power had been solidified, and the kingdom remained largely in awe of his ability to exact justice. However, the fate of Babrak and the king's extreme method of punishment left an indelible mark on the kingdom's history. It was an event that would be remembered for generations, a chilling reminder of the consequences of betrayal and the fine line between justice and tyranny. The people's respect for the king grew, but so did their fear. They began to realize that their ruler, while just in his own eyes, was capable of cruelty when crossed. The fear that had once been reserved for corrupt officials now extended to anyone who dared to challenge Shahriar's authority. The once thriving political intrigue of the court turned into a quiet, cautious game where every move was carefully considered. Though the kingdom thrived under Shahriar's rule, the event of Babrak's death left a lasting impression. The balance of power had shifted dramatically in the kingdom, and while many saw the king's actions as a victory for justice, others saw it as a harbinger of a more authoritarian reign. In the years that followed, Shahriar's rule became synonymous with unyielding control and harsh retribution. And for those who had once thought they could deceive the king, Babrak's fate was a terrifying reminder. Betrayal would be met with the full force of royal power. The kingdom would never again be the same, and neither would the legacy of the king who took a man's skin to defend his throne.